In the autumn of 220 BCE, as the last flames of the Warring States period flickered and died, something monstrous was born in the palaces of China. It would endure for over 2 millennia, consuming the lives of millions of women whose names we will never know, whose voices were silenced before they could speak, whose bodies became instruments of state power and dynastic ambition. A dynasty was not merely a ruling family, it was a divine institution, a cosmic order that claimed dominion over heaven and earth. Over 2,000 years of unbroken imperial rule, China was governed by successive dynasties. The emperor was no ordinary monarch. He was the son of heaven, the sole mediator between the divine realm and the mortal world. Every action he took, every word he spoke, every woman he touched was believed to ripple through the cosmic order. His virility was the empire's strength. His bloodline was the nation's future. His progeny were the guarantee of eternal rule. This divine status created an insatiable hunger for reproductive control. The emperor's seed was sacred, but it could not be wasted on a single woman. The production of heirs, multiple heirs, backup heirs, heirs upon heirs, became a matter of imperial survival. And so the palace became a factory of flesh, a reproductive machine that would consume generations of girls and women in its relentless pursuit of dynastic continuity. The Forbidden City in Beijing, constructed during the Ming Dynasty, housed over 9,000 rooms. Many of these chambers were designed not for governance or ceremony, but for the housing, monitoring, and sexual exploitation of thousands of concubines. The palace was a city within a city, a world sealed off from the outside, where young girls entered and aged women died, where names were stripped away and identities dissolved into titles and numbers. These palaces were not homes. They were prisons, dressed in silk. They were factories of human breeding disguised as centers of culture and refinement. Behind their vermilion walls and golden roofs lay a systematic architecture of sexual slavery, blood and order, the birth of concubinage in the Qin-Han world. The first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang, was a man who standardized everything: currency, writing, measurements, and human suffering. When he unified the Warring States in 221 BCE, he brought not just political order, but sexual regimentation to the Chinese world. His palace housed hundreds of women, taken from the conquered territories as spoils of war, living symbols of his dominance over the known world. But it was during the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, that concubinage transformed from imperial indulgence into state policy. The Han legal codes, preserved in fragmentary texts, make chilling distinctions between wives and secondary women. A wife held legal status, property rights, and social recognition. A concubine was property, bought, sold, traded, and disposed of at will. The Han emperors institutionalized what would become a 2,000-year nightmare. Emperor Wu of Han, 156 to 87 BCE, maintained a harem of over 3,000 women, organized into rigid hierarchies with specific titles, ranks, and functions. At the top were the imperial consorts, women of noble birth who might bear future emperors. Below them were the talented ladies, selected for beauty or accomplishment. At the bottom were the serving women, girls taken from peasant families, often as young as 12, who served the sexual needs of the emperor and his court. The story of consort Zhao Feiyan illuminates the brutal reality beneath the imperial glamour. Born into poverty, she was conscripted into the palace of Emperor Qing of Han around 18 BCE. Court records describe her as slender as a swallow, possessed of a beauty that captivated the emperor. For a brief moment, she wielded enormous power, manipulating imperial favor to elevate her family and destroy her rivals. But power in the harem was always precarious. When Emperor Qing died without an heir, a failure blamed on the women in his harem, Zhao Feiyan became a scapegoat. Court officials whispered that she had murdered pregnant concubines to prevent rival heirs. Whether true or false, these accusations sealed her fate. The new emperor ordered her execution in 1 BCE. She was forced to commit suicide, her body thrown into an unmarked grave, her name struck from official records. Zhao Feiyan's rise and fall established a pattern that would repeat across centuries. Women pulled from obscurity into the imperial bed, granted temporary power through sexual favor, then destroyed when that favor shifted. The palace was a lottery where every ticket was ultimately a losing one. The Han period also saw the emergence of the eunuch bureaucracy that would administer the harem system. These castrated men, denied the possibility of sexual rivalry with the emperor, became the jailers and executioners of the concubine system. They monitored the women's menstrual cycles, documented their sexual encounters with the emperor, and administered punishments for infractions real or imagined. Palace records from the later Han period describe a systematic approach to reproductive control that would make modern factory farming seem primitive. Women were housed in separate quarters based on their fertility status. Those who were pregnant were moved to special chambers and monitored constantly. Those who gave birth to sons were elevated in rank and privilege. Those who bore daughters were often discarded. Those who remained barren after several years were sometimes executed or sold to brothels. The fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE came amid massive civil war and social collapse, but the concubine system survived. As warlords carved up the empire, they adopted the sexual practices of the emperors they claimed to succeed. The systematic exploitation of women had become so embedded in Chinese imperial culture that it was considered as natural and necessary as taxation or military service. Empire through the veil, Tang Dynasty's golden age and its shadow. The Tang Dynasty represented the pinnacle of Chinese imperial power, a golden age of poetry, art, trade, and territorial expansion. Tang armies conquered territories from Korea to Central Asia. Tang merchants traded along the Silk Road, bringing goods and ideas from across the known world. Tang poets created works that are still considered masterpieces of human expression. And Tang emperors maintained harems of unprecedented size and international scope, turning sexual exploitation into a tool of imperial diplomacy and cultural dominance. Emperor Xuanzong, 685 to 762 CE, ruled during the Tang dynasty's height, presiding over an empire of nearly 60 million people. His harem reflected this vast reach. It contained over 40,000 women, drawn not just from Chinese families, but from across the empire's tributary states. Korean girls from the Kingdom of Silla, Central Asian beauties from Sogdian merchant families, Tibetan princesses sent as diplomatic gifts, all were absorbed into the imperial sexual machine. These women were not volunteers. They were tribute, human offerings sent by subordinate rulers to acknowledge Tang supremacy. Court records describe the annual presentation of beauties, elaborate ceremonies where vassal states would offer their most attractive daughters to the emperor. Refusal to participate was considered an act of rebellion. The Tang Palace complex in Chang'an housed these thousands of women in a maze of courtyards, gardens, and chambers that covered several square miles. Foreign visitors described it as a city of women, where entire quarters were populated solely by concubines and their eunuch guardians. The women lived in a state of perpetual competition, vying for the emperor's attention in a sexual marketplace where failure meant invisibility, neglect, and eventual death. The most notorious example of Tang harem politics was the rise of Yang Guifei, known as Yang the Precious Consort. Originally the concubine of Emperor Xuanzong's son, she was taken by the emperor himself around 745 CE, when she was in her 20s and he was over 60. Her beauty was said to be so extraordinary that the emperor neglected state affairs to spend time with her. Contemporary accounts describe Yang Guifei as manipulative and power-hungry, using her sexual hold over the aging emperor to advance her family's interests and accumulate vast wealth. Her brother Yang Guozhong was appointed to high government positions despite his incompetence. Her relatives were showered with titles and riches. The court became a playground for her extended family, while the empire's borders came under increasing pressure from rebellious generals and foreign invaders. The catastrophic climax came in 755 CE with the An Lushan rebellion. An Lushan was a general of mixed Chinese and barbarian ancestry who had ingratiated himself with Yang Guifei and her faction. When he launched his rebellion against the Tang throne, his armies swept across northern China with devastating efficiency. The emperor and his court were forced to flee the capital, abandoning Chang'an to the rebels. During the chaotic retreat, imperial guards mutinied and demanded Yang Guifei's execution, blaming her for the crisis that had brought the empire to its knees. Emperor Xuanzong, faced with the choice between his beloved concubine and his throne, ordered her strangulation. She was killed at a roadside inn, her body hastily buried in an unmarked grave. The emperor, broken by grief and guilt, abdicated soon after. The An Lushan rebellion lasted 8 years and killed an estimated 36 million people, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. While the rebellion had multiple causes, including military overextension and fiscal crisis, it had been triggered by the sexual politics of the imperial harem. A woman's beauty had become a weapon that nearly destroyed an empire. Official Tang histories compiled after the dynasty's recovery placed the blame squarely on Yang Guifei and the corrupting influence of female sexuality on imperial governance. One court historian wrote that the palace had become overflowing with fragrance and treason, where 10,000 beauties competed for favor while the empire burned. But the real horror was not the political chaos, it was the fate of the thousands of forgotten women who perished when the system collapsed. When An Lushan's armies captured Chang'an, they found the imperial harem largely abandoned. Many concubines had been left behind during the court's hasty flight. Some were raped and murdered by the rebel soldiers. Others starved in the sealed palace chambers. Archaeological excavations in the 1990s uncovered mass graves near the Tang palace sites, filled with the skeletons of young women who died during the rebellion years. The Tang dynasty eventually recovered from the An Lushan catastrophe, but it never regained its former glory. The empire contracted, the military weakened, and the economy stagnated. Yet the harem system continued unchanged. Later, Tang emperors maintained vast collections of concubines, seemingly oblivious to the role that sexual politics had played in their dynasty's near destruction. Confucian control, Song dynasty, and the bureaucratization of women. The Song dynasty emerged from the chaos of the late Tang period with a new vision of imperial governance. Where the Tang had been militaristic and expansionist, the Song were scholarly and introspective. They created the most sophisticated bureaucracy in human history, a merit-based civil service system that recruited officials through rigorous examinations. They fostered technological innovation, artistic refinement, and philosophical development, and they systematized the oppression of women with a thoroughness that would have impressed the most dedicated totalitarian regime. The Song period saw the rise of Neo-Confucianism, a philosophical movement that codified patriarchal authority as a cosmic principle. Led by scholars like Zhu Xi, 1130 to 1200, Neo-Confucians argued that social hierarchy was not just politically convenient, but metaphysically necessary. The subordination of women to men, they claimed, reflected the fundamental order of the universe. Zhu Xi wrote, "A woman without virtue threatens the state itself. Her chastity is the foundation of social order, her obedience the cornerstone of imperial authority." These were not mere philosophical abstractions. They became the basis for legal codes that regulated every aspect of female existence. Under Song law, concubinage was not just tolerated but encouraged as a means of ensuring male lineage continuation. A man whose wife failed to produce sons was not only permitted but expected to acquire concubines. These women had no legal rights, no property claims, and no protection from abuse. They could be bought, sold, beaten, or killed with minimal legal consequences. The Song also introduced the practice of foot binding, the systematic crippling of girls' feet to create the tiny, deformed appendages that elite men found sexually attractive. Beginning around age 5 or 6, girls' feet were wrapped in tight bindings that broke the bones and folded the toes under the sole. The process was agonizing and often led to infection, gangrene, and death. Foot binding served multiple functions in the concubine system. It made women physically helpless, unable to run away or move freely without assistance. It created a visible marker of sexual availability and submission, and it transformed women's bodies into objects of male fantasy, reducing them to collections of sexually arousing deformities. Court records from the Song period reveal the systematic nature of female oppression. In 1127, when the dynasty was forced to relocate south due to foreign invasion, detailed inventories were kept of imperial property, including the concubines. Women were listed alongside furniture, artworks, and livestock, categorized by age, beauty, and breeding potential. One particularly chilling case from 1156 involves a concubine in the imperial harem who was executed for laughing too freely during a court ceremony. The woman, identified only as third-ranked beauty Chen, had apparently smiled at something amusing during a religious ritual. This was interpreted as disrespect toward the emperor and the cosmic order he represented. She was sentenced to death by strangulation, her body thrown into a mass grave with other executed palace women. The Song period also saw the expansion of concubinage beyond the imperial court into the broader elite class. Wealthy merchants, high-ranking officials, and successful scholars all maintained multiple concubines as symbols of their status and success. The practice became so common that sumptuary laws were passed regulating how many concubines men of different ranks could legally possess. This democratization of sexual exploitation created a vast market in human trafficking. Poor families sold their daughters to slave dealers who transported them to cities where they were sold to wealthy men. The trade was so extensive that specialized brothels emerged where potential buyers could inspect and test the merchandise before purchase. Contemporary accounts describe these markets in horrific detail. Girls were displayed naked on auction blocks, their bodies examined by potential buyers like livestock at a cattle market. Those who showed signs of disease or defect were often killed on the spot, their bodies disposed of in nearby rivers or dumped in mass graves outside the city walls. The Song dynasty's fall in 1279 came not from internal rebellion, but from foreign conquest, first by the Jurchens, who established the Qin dynasty in northern China, then by the Mongols under Kublai Khan. But the concubine system survived both invasions. The foreign conquerors, eager to legitimize their rule over Chinese subjects, adopted the sexual practices of the dynasties they had destroyed. Empire of Flesh, the Ming dynasty's machine of reproductive control. When Zhu Yuanzhang overthrew the Mongol Yuan dynasty in 1368 and established the Ming dynasty, he promised to restore authentic Chinese civilization after a century of foreign rule. He rebuilt the imperial capital, reconstructed the bureaucracy, and reinstituted traditional Chinese customs. But his most ambitious project was the creation of a reproductive apparatus that would dwarf anything attempted by previous dynasties. The Ming emperors, ruling from their new capital in Beijing, constructed the Forbidden City, a palace complex of unprecedented size and sophistication. Within its vermillion walls lived not just the imperial family and their servants, but thousands upon thousands of concubines, organized into the most systematic sexual hierarchy in human history. Emperor Yongle, the third Ming emperor and builder of the Forbidden City, maintained a harem of approximately 2,800 women. His successors expanded this number steadily. By the late Ming period, the imperial harem contained over 9,000 concubines, making it the largest collection of sex slaves in human history. The scale of this operation required massive administrative infrastructure. The palace employed thousands of eunuchs to manage the women, guarding them, feeding them, monitoring their health, and regulating their access to the emperor. The most horrific aspect of the Ming concubine system was its disposal methods. When emperors died, large numbers of their concubines were buried alive with them, ostensibly to serve their needs in the afterlife. This practice, known as accompanying burial, was so systematic that special burial chambers were constructed adjacent to imperial tombs to accommodate the corpses. The death of Emperor Yongle in 1424 was followed by the execution of dozens of his concubines, Court records describe them being forced to drink poison or having their necks broken by executioners. One account, preserved in the Ming veritable records, states, "The emperor must not pass alone into the next realm. His women shall accompany him, as is fitting and proper." Consort Li, a favorite of the Hongxi emperor, Yonggle's eldest son, was among those chosen to be buried with the emperor. Contemporary accounts describe her final hours. She was dressed in imperial robes, given a ceremonial meal, then led to a specially constructed chamber beneath the emperor's tomb. There, she was buried along with 15 other women, their bodies arranged around a central altar where the emperor's coffin would be placed. Archaeological excavations of Ming imperial tombs in the 1950s confirmed these accounts, uncovering chambers filled with the skeletons of young women, many showing signs of violent death. Some skulls were fractured, suggesting they had been beaten to death. Others showed compression marks around the neck, indicating strangulation. All were between the ages of 15 and 25. The Ming dynasty's sexual apparatus reached its peak of efficiency during the reign of Emperor Wanli, 1563 to 1620, who maintained a harem of over 9,000 women while conducting state business through written memorials, rarely appearing in person at court. His withdrawal from public life created a power vacuum that was filled by palace eunuchs, who used their control over the concubine system to manipulate imperial policy and accumulate vast wealth. This corruption contributed to the dynasty's eventual collapse. As the Ming state weakened under the weight of military pressure from the north and peasant rebellions in the heartland, the palace continued to consume enormous resources maintaining its vast harem. When Beijing fell to rebel forces in 1644, the last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree in the imperial garden, but not before ordering the execution of his remaining concubines to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The Frozen Court, Qing Dynasty, and the ethnic politics of concubinage. The Manchu conquest of China in 1644 brought not liberation but intensification of the concubine system. The Qing Dynasty, established by the Manchu people from the northeastern frontier, used sexual exploitation as a tool of ethnic domination, creating the most rigid and racialized harem system in Chinese history. The Manchus were a minority ruling over a vastly larger Han Chinese population. To maintain their authority, they developed sophisticated strategies of cultural control, military organization, and sexual politics. The harem became a laboratory for ethnic engineering, where Manchu, Mongol, and Han Chinese women were segregated, ranked, and bred according to imperial racial policies. The Qing emperors established the Eight Banners system, organizing their subjects into hereditary military and administrative units defined by ethnicity and loyalty. This system extended into the harem, where women were classified as banner girls of Manchu or Mongol descent, or civilian girls from the Han Chinese population. The ethnic hierarchies were rigid and absolute. Manchu banner girls held higher status regardless of their personal qualities or family backgrounds. Emperor Kangxi, who ruled for 61 years, maintained a harem of approximately 3,000 women with strict quotas for different ethnic groups. Manchu banner girls held the highest ranks and were eligible to become empresses or imperial consorts. Mongol girls served as symbols of the Qing-Mongol alliance that had facilitated the conquest of China. Han Chinese girls, when they were admitted at all, occupied the lowest positions and were used primarily for manual labor and sexual service. The Qing harem was physically organized along ethnic lines. The Forbidden City was divided into separate quarters for different groups, with Manchu women occupying the most prestigious locations near the emperor's personal chambers. Mongol women lived in secondary compounds, while Han Chinese women were housed in remote corners of the palace, sometimes in underground chambers that rarely saw sunlight. The sexual politics of the Qing harem were explicitly designed to maintain Manchu demographic dominance. Emperor Kangxi issued secret edicts requiring that a majority of his sexual encounters be with Manchu women, ensuring that potential heirs would have pure Manchu bloodlines. Han Chinese concubines were often subjected to contraceptive herbs to prevent pregnancy, or their newborns were quietly disposed of if they seemed likely to challenge Manchu succession rights. The most tragic example of Qing harem politics was the fate of the Pearl Concubine, consort Zhen, a young Manchu woman who became entangled in the palace power struggles of the late dynasty. Born Tatara Zhen in 1876, she was selected for the harem of Emperor Guangxu at age 13. Unlike most concubines, she was literate and politically aware, sympathizing with her young husband's attempts to modernize China through the 100 Days Reform movement of 1898. When the reforms were crushed by the Empress Dowager Cixi, the Pearl Concubine was marked for destruction. Cixi, the real power behind the throne, viewed the young woman as a dangerous influence on the emperor. Court records suggest that the Pearl Concubine had encouraged Guangxu's reform efforts and may have helped him communicate with progressive officials outside the palace. During the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, as foreign armies advanced on Beijing, Cixi ordered the execution of the Pearl Concubine to prevent her from falling into enemy hands or being used as a political symbol by reform movements. On July 20, 1900, the 24-year-old woman was dragged to a well in the Imperial garden and thrown in to drown. The execution was witnessed by several palace eunuchs, whose accounts were preserved in the Palace Museum archives. One wrote, "She cried out for mercy, but the Empress Dowager was unmoved. She has displeased me by speaking too freely," she said. The girl was forced into the well, and stones were thrown down to ensure she would not emerge. The Pearl Concubine's murder exemplified the casual brutality with which even high-ranking concubines could be disposed of when they became politically inconvenient. Her death was covered up for decades, officially attributed to suicide during the foreign invasion. Only in the 1980s did Chinese historians acknowledge the truth of her execution. The Qing harem system reached its most elaborate form under Emperor Qianlong, who maintained over 4,000 concubines during his 63-year reign. As the Qing dynasty weakened during the 19th century under pressure from Western imperialism and internal rebellion, the harem system became increasingly dysfunctional. Palace eunuchs accumulated enormous wealth and power by selling access to the emperor and manipulating the concubine selection process. Corruption became so extensive that positions in the harem were openly bought and sold, with wealthy families purchasing concubine status for their daughters as a form of social advancement. The system's final collapse came with the 1911 revolution that ended over 2,000 years of imperial rule. But even as the dynasty crumbled, the machinery of sexual exploitation continued operating. The last emperor, Puyi, maintained a small harem even after his abdication, keeping several concubines in the Forbidden City until he was finally expelled by Republican forces in 1924. Revolution and ruin, the collapse of the system. The Xinhai Revolution of 1911 that toppled the Qing dynasty promised to modernize China and end the feudal practices that had oppressed the Chinese people for millennia. Revolutionary leaders like Sun Yat-sen spoke of equality, democracy, and women's liberation. The new Republic of China officially abolished the imperial system, dismantled the palace bureaucracy, and declared an end to concubinage. But revolution is easier proclaimed than achieved. When the last emperor abdicated in February 1912, thousands of women remained trapped in the Forbidden City, concubines, servants, palace maids, and eunuchs who had known no other world. The new Republican government, focused on political consolidation and foreign relations, gave little thought to these human remnants of the imperial system. The immediate aftermath was chaos. With the palace bureaucracy dissolved, no one remained to feed, house, or manage the women who had been confined within the Forbidden City's walls. Many had been in the palace for decades and had no families to return to, no skills beyond pleasing men, and no resources for survival in the outside world. Foreign journalists who gained access to the Forbidden City in the 1910s described scenes of almost incomprehensible desolation. Hundreds of women, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly matrons, wandered the vast palace halls like ghosts. They continued to observe the rigid hierarchies and behavioral codes that had governed their lives under the empire, bowing to empty thrones and maintaining the daily rituals of a court that no longer existed. Dr. Isaac Taylor Headland, an American missionary who visited the palace in 1913, wrote, "They stood against the walls of the great halls, eyes vacant, hands folded, waiting for orders that would never come. Some had been concubines of the Guangxu emperor, others servants of the Empress Dowager. They spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the silence of their abandoned world." The new Republican government offered no assistance to these women. Officials argued that they were remnants of the old regime and that helping them would legitimize the imperial system the revolution had overthrown. Some were eventually expelled from the palace and forced onto the streets of Beijing, where they joined the ranks of beggars and prostitutes that crowded the city. Others remained within the Forbidden City's walls, sustained by the charitable efforts of a few sympathetic eunuchs who had managed to hide small amounts of wealth during the transition. These women survived by selling palace artifacts to antique dealers and foreign collectors, gradually stripping the imperial complex of its treasures in exchange for rice and coal. The fate of individual women varied dramatically based on age, health, and social connections. Younger concubines sometimes found employment as servants in wealthy households or married men willing to overlook their palace backgrounds. But many older women, particularly those who had been in the palace for decades, found themselves completely unable to adapt to life outside the imperial system. Lady Derling, a former court lady who published memoirs of her palace experience, described encountering former concubines in Beijing's streets during the 1920s. They begged with the same dignity they had once displayed in the presence of the emperor. Their movements retained the careful grace of court training, even as they held out their hands for coins. It was heartbreaking to see the remnants of imperial elegance reduced to such desperate circumstances. The warlord period that followed the Republic's collapse, 1916 to 1928, brought fresh horrors to China's women. As military strongmen carved up the former empire, many attempted to recreate the sexual privileges of the imperial system. Zhang Zuolin, the warlord who controlled Manchuria, maintained a harem of over 200 women in his Shenyang palace. Other warlords established smaller but equally exploitative collections of concubines, often kidnapping girls from villages they controlled or purchasing them from human traffickers. The Japanese invasion of 1937 added new dimensions of sexual violence to China's suffering. Japanese forces systematically established comfort stations throughout occupied China, forcing tens of thousands of Chinese women into sexual slavery. Many of these victims were former concubines or the daughters of concubines, women already marginalized by their association with the discredited imperial system. The civil war between the nationalists and communists, 1927 to 1949, brought no respite. Both sides used rape and sexual violence as weapons of war, and women connected to the old imperial system were particular targets. Communist forces, claiming to represent the oppressed masses, often singled out former concubines and their families for brutal treatment, viewing them as collaborators with feudal oppression. By the late 1940s, virtually all the women who had lived in the imperial harems were dead. Some had died of starvation or disease in the chaos following the revolution. Others had been killed in the wars that convulsed China for decades. A few had managed to create new lives outside the palace system, but even these survivors carried the psychological scars of their experiences. Skeletons beneath the walls, aftermath and endurance. When the Communist Party of China declared victory in 1949 and established the People's Republic, it promised to create a new society based on equality and justice. The new constitution explicitly guaranteed women's rights and declared gender equality a fundamental principle of the socialist state. The old imperial palaces were converted into museums, and the Forbidden City became a symbol of China's liberation from feudal oppression. But beneath the rhetoric of liberation lay a more complex and troubling reality. The communist government, while officially condemning the imperial system, showed little interest in documenting its victims or acknowledging their suffering. The women who had been enslaved in the harems were not celebrated as survivors of oppression. They were forgotten, their experiences erased from official histories as embarrassing remnants of China's feudal past. The physical evidence of their ordeal, however, could not be so easily eliminated. In 1958, during construction work near the Forbidden City, workers uncovered the first of what would become dozens of mass graves containing the remains of young women. The initial discovery was kept secret, with officials attributing the bodies to victims of the Japanese occupation or the Civil War. These archaeological discoveries were kept classified for decades. The Chinese government, sensitive about its historical reputation and unwilling to acknowledge the full extent of imperial-era oppression, restricted access to the findings and prohibited their publication in academic journals. It was not until the late 1990s that Chinese historians were permitted to study the remains, and even then under strict limitations. This discomfort was not merely academic. Despite official promises of gender equality, the communist period saw the emergence of new forms of female oppression that echoed the logic of the imperial harem system. The one-child policy, implemented in 1979 to control population growth, created powerful incentives for son preference that resulted in systematic discrimination against girls. The introduction of ultrasound technology in the 1980s enabled sex-selective abortions on an unprecedented scale. Families who discovered they were carrying female fetuses often chose to terminate the pregnancies, hoping to try again for male children. The practice became so widespread that China's gender ratio at birth became severely distorted, reaching 120 boys for every 100 girls by the early 2000s, far beyond the natural ratio of 105 to 100. In rural areas, where traditional attitudes toward women remained strongest, the devaluation of female life was expressed in stark terms. A common saying emerged: "Raising a daughter is like watering someone else's field," meaning that investing in girls was wasteful since they would eventually marry and serve other families. This logic, which had justified the sexual exploitation of women in imperial harems, now justified their elimination before birth. The scale of this gender-based elimination was staggering. Demographic studies conducted in the 2000s estimated that over 30 million women were missing from China's population due to sex-selective abortions, female infanticide, and differential medical care that favored boys over girls. This represented one of the largest cases of systematic gender-based killing in human history, a genocide that occurred not through overt violence, but through millions of individual decisions shaped by cultural attitudes that devalued female life. The final irony was that the physical spaces where millions of women had been tortured and murdered became symbols of Chinese cultural achievement. The Forbidden City, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site and major tourist attraction, welcomed millions of visitors annually who admired its architecture and artistry while remaining largely ignorant of the human suffering that had occurred within its walls. In the end, the most devastating aspect of China's imperial concubine system was not the number of women it killed, though that number was in the millions, but the completeness of their erasure. These women had been denied names, denied voices, denied dignity in life. They had been denied memory, denied recognition, denied justice in death. They had been reduced to numbers, to functions, to objects, and ultimately, to silence.